Bonjour. Here we are, History Through Art. The title is, you see, Learning History Through Art. And I guess something I'd say is that how I got into this kind of thing was through teaching history through art. Because something I found when I was teaching courses on European history was that the really best primary sources to share with students was artwork. In other words, it's not something that is usually done. Usually it's historical prints. But I find that paintings often contain so much material. And the thing about it is they're right from the time period. And it's an artist who's giving his impression of something, and he's not being self-conscious about being historical. So we're able to look over his shoulder with the work that he does. And so, as Gordon had mentioned, there's kind of a complex relationship between artists and historical developments. And so in this presentation this morning, what I'd like to do is focus on three of these relationships. And the first one being art celebrating history. So at certain historical periods, artists, you could say, very much got into the spirit of the times and promoted philosophical developments, historical developments, sometimes economic developments. So we begin with the Renaissance, centered in Florence, and there's a real contrast between the art that was developed in the Renaissance and the art that preceded it in the medieval period. And what this has a lot to do with is conceptions of humanity. In other words, conceptions of mankind. A medieval-oriented print, and Ship of Fools. So human beings being presented, Ship of Fools. Often you're seeing depictions of ordinary people in Last Judgment scenes, where they're either headed up to heaven, or, well, in this case, they're all pretty much headed down. And here's another Last Judgment scene. Here we've got the elect who are heading up through the pearly gates, but there are a number of other destinations. And it's almost like the default destination was down. It was really understood that it was only through the agency of the church that it is possible for someone to overcome the burden of original sin and rise. Otherwise, it's down. So a term that's used in the theology of the time was fallen man. In other words, there was an understanding theologically that human beings had inherited the sin of Adam and Eve, and that they carried that stain upon them. So this was kind of a medieval worldview. And so you see the agency of the church. Through confession, absolution, then it was possible to rise. But as people as they were, that was not the case. So the King of France, King Louis, would do penance. Here, in this case, he's being whipped by a monk at the king's request. You can see the fleur-de-lis of the royal emblem on there, and King Louis went to Mass 3-4 times a day through his entire life. And he still was hoping he'd make it. Flagellants. When there were plague, times of difficulty, famine, there was a presumption that it was because of human sin. And so what individuals would often do in procession, sometimes large numbers of them, would be to, as they walked and chanted, to whip themselves, to scourge themselves from their sin. with Renaissance Florence, a different view got introduced. And this is, here's Pico della Mirandola. There's a work, Oration on the Dignity of Man, not on the sinfulness of man. And when we're going to be talking about Renaissance Florence, Jeppe had mentioned that course that's being done on cities of intrigue. Well, our first city is going to be Florence. And one of the things we'll be talking about are some of the preconditions, some of the things that happened that caused this philosophical change, this change in outlook, this rise in confidence, this rise in the view of human potential and the state of human beings. In that, what Pico della Mirandola is saying in there is that it's not given what a human being is. There are steps and stages. You can, as in nature, you can have minerals, plants, animals, and intelligent beings. So with humanity, you can have people who are slothful, who are just they are. Then you can have people who are there and indulgence, in gluttony, and not and at a low level. And then you can have people who are living in luxury, and they're at a feeling level, but then you also have the possibility of what was called virtue. In other words, of individuals who raise themselves up, not through the agency of the church, but through the agency of philosophy, of learning. The term that's used for this person here is studiitum. Someone who studies. It's through study that they rise. Birth of Venus. So Botticelli, in this painting, is doing two things. This is the first representation in painting of a human nude figure in 1,000 years in the West. In other words, not since Roman times had there been a painting that featured a nude woman. And I guess the thing I'd want to say is this painting is renowned even today because if it's a representation of beauty. We could go through a great many images from medieval times of human beings. But beauty is not something you really would see. In other words, there was this sort of general feeling of fallen man over on top of people. And with Botticelli, you've got Birth of Venus, and Venus is rising out of the sea. He's doing something else here. Venus, in this very Christian environment that we're talking about, where fallen man was the dominant theme, this is a goddess. This is a deity. But it's a deity of a different sort, in that what we've got here is a pagan deity. In other words, this is from the classical world. Venus is a Roman goddess. And he is daring to depict this pagan goddess, and done in a very beautiful manner. So I guess what I'm saying here is this is a revolutionary painting. And it's celebrating philosophical development that had been taking place over the course of a century in Florence. And the philosophy that's that this art is a manifestation of is humanism, Renaissance humanism. And I just want to make a quick contrast here between the great discipline, the great learning, the great area of study in medieval times was theology. Study of God, yes? The great philosophy that develops in the Renaissance is humanism. Very different orientation. The focus, not so much on the divine, focus on humanity. Primavera, springtime. Botticelli, another of Botticelli's works, and he is again presenting mythological figures, but in human form. And when I was talking about human dignity, these are figures that have dignity, bearing. They're not saints. They're sort of ideal forms. I'd like to make a toast. So here is to Renaissance humanism, here is to the celebration of beauty, and here's to a little lubrication as we go along. Something while I'm taking a pause, something I'd like to say is, I know that it's characteristic in these Sunday symposiums to have a talk that will go on for a period of time, and then the talk will finally reach its end. There'll be a time for opportunity for questions and comments. That's not exactly the way I like to operate. So something I had talked with the organizers here about is that I'd like to do it more like the way I do my classes, which is to talk for a period of time and then pause and offer an opportunity for questions or comments at that point, just so that people aren't having to store up questions for an entire hour. Is that acceptable? Sure. Terrific, good, all right. So I'll plunge further on in. So, but I will offer these opportunities. So, Michelangelo, creation of Adam. This is a kind of emblematic work of the Renaissance. And here you have Adam, who's there in a beautiful form, graceful form, but a little like an animal, in the sense, you know how an animal is either active or at rest. That's not sort of this nervous agitation you'd ever see. And Adam there is thoroughly at rest. And all the intention, all the intelligence, all the consciousness is coming from God. And in a moment, the spark is going to jump. And then Adam will be infused with some of that divine power, some of that divine consciousness. And I guess that's something I want to say, is that Michelangelo is saying, this is what's inside of human beings. This is what can be cultivated. This could be, education can leave this out of human beings and raise them up. This was not a perception of humanity, not an option really that was seen in medieval times or presented. And then you get David. I've known people who, when they have entered there's a gallery in Florence, and the way they've got David is he's down at the end. So you kind of turn a corner, and there he is. And I know people who burst into tears at this sight. And it has occurred to me that if an alien, spaceship came down and landed outside my house one day, and the person got out and said, I've only got a few minutes here. Can you give me a sense of what's possible with your race, with your species? I'd say, well, can we take a quick trip to Florence? Because I'd like to show you David. Here's David at this moment. Now, David sometimes has this kind of text that goes along with him. But we try to ignore that. What we focus on is just his magnificence. And fulfillment. This is human fulfillment. There was nothing like this for 1,000 years. So I guess in a certain way, what happens with the Renaissance is they get this infusion, in the way that God was sort of there with creation of Adam, doing this infusion. In a certain way, what the Renaissance is about is an infusion of classical values. Because the Greeks and the Romans, they didn't have that conception of fallen man. And so what happened with the Renaissance is you had medieval society with the developments that had been made, the universities that existed, but then you had that infusion of a whole new way of viewing things that included human dignity, human beauty, human potential. I wish to pause. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this point? Please, just raise your hand. And Virginia has a microphone here. Excellent point. So in the Sistine Chapel, this painting is on the ceiling, right in the center of the Sistine Chapel. When you're there, you look up right in the middle, and there it is, in that central position. But on the end wall is a scene, a Last Judgment scene, done by Michelangelo. I mean, we saw some medieval Last Judgment scenes. When Michelangelo painted that, he painted human forms in their actual state, the way Greeks and Romans would. And so he painted them nude, including Christ. Frontal nudity. This was shocking to some in the church, but a lot of the cardinals and the popes were sophisticated and accepted this. However, the pope who sort of followed Michelangelo hired another painter to come in and paint in loincloths. So if you see the Last Judgment today, you see all these figures with these strategically draped pieces of cloth. That was added on. Michelangelo, he saw that was part of human beauty, right? And saw no reason to sort of cover that up, no reason for shame to be connected with that. Well, as I say, it's philosophical developments that so what you're having is how did this happen? The philosophical development. So it really starts with Petrarch, who was a scholar in the 14th century, in the previous century in Florence. And he was the one who first started uncovering old Greek and Roman texts that had some of this classical philosophy. And you don't talk about classical humanism. That's something really that was a Renaissance development, where they put that together. But there were philosophers. Pico della Mirandola was the leading one in the following century. But but something I want to say, and it was tied in, I should say, that it was tied in with the political organization in Florence. Because Florence, unlike virtually everywhere else in the entire continent of Europe, was a republic. It was a self-governing republic. And there was a concept of civic humanism. And just in the sense that people are fit to run their own government. That fit in with that also. That was part of that philosophical development. And what you see with the art is a manifestation, a visual manifestation of this. I mean, we could read the treatises, but I warn you, they're a little thick. Plus, they're in Latin. These paintings are readily accessible. You'll see. What was supporting them? His patrons were the Medicis. And the Medicis were the leading family in Florence, and had great power in that sense. But even more than that, and it gets into economics that again in the course we'll be talking about, which is that the largest the largest financial institution in the world in medieval times, in Renaissance times, was the Catholic Church. The papal bankers were the Medicis. In other words, handling all the financial transactions of the papacy was the Medici family. Do you see the connection here? How the Medicis provided a kind of protection? So in other words, Botticelli did not have to worry about the church coming down on him because his patrons were the Medicis. And furthermore, I guess something I want to say, some of these philosophers in Florence said when there were churchmen who protested against this sort of bringing forth of pagan philosophy and pagan deities in these paintings, there were philosophers who said, well, wait a second. The early fathers of the church were opposed to anything like this. But that was when Christianity was just getting going. That's when things were delicate and fragile. Now Christianity rules the continent. Nobody's going to become a pagan because they see Venus there, rising on a half shell, right? So in other words, we don't need to be concerned. We can have a level of confidence. And so that was another reason that was a compelling argument. So the leadership of the church supported this type of art, and also this was a reasonable argument to people. Dottie has a question here. There was a preacher who came along. You know how there are swings of the pendulum, and there was a reaction to some of this very progressive type of art. that showed lots of nudes and classical figures. And there was a sort of a religious fundamentalist who rose to power in Florence against the Medicis. And this was Savonarola. And Savonarola was something like a Puritan. It was sort of, and one of his followers was Botticelli himself. And so Savonarola in the center square, in the big piazza in Florence, had a bonfire where people put statues and paintings and fine gowns and lit it up and burned it. The bonfire of the vanities. And Botticelli did this with some of his paintings. Now, those paintings we were seeing were big frescoes in a villa. So they were safe from that. So no, they didn't. There were paintings of Botticelli that he did offer up to the fire. But that was, so I guess you know what I'm sort of saying, history's not a straight line. You get sort of jigs and jogs. And so one of those had to do with this sort of reaction to the sort of progressive classicism.
All the emotions of a young person who's ill at ease and not sure of himself, and yet he's this beautiful man.
Right.
But it's just a tremendous...
Yes, it's very powerful. It's a point being made in this gallery in Florence. As you go down towards this wonderful statue, there are these very powerful sculptures by Michelangelo that are kind of in the raw. He didn't even finish them. And they have an extra power because of that. I think I'd like to proceed. S'il vous plaît. So thank you very much for your comments and questions on this. So we have Raphael here, School of Athens, where he is showing Greek and Roman philosophers, all of them pagans. Right front and center you have Plato and Aristotle, and he paints in Leonardo da Vinci, the features of Leonardo da Vinci on Plato, going up to that spirit world. Portrait of a Renaissance gentleman. It's not just beautiful women. Beautiful, dignified gentlemen. And then you get the grace of this Sistine Madonna. So here is a religious painting, but one done with beauty and grace by Raphael. Another period where you get an instance where art was celebrating history is in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, particularly in France. So where the Renaissance was centered in northern Italy, with the Enlightenment, the center was in France, and here we have this figure of Louis the 14th, with no question whatsoever about his dignity. No one accused Louis XIV of suffering from qualms of self-esteem. And he had a nice little place built. So here's Versailles. You can see, and here you have, with the Enlightenment, this kind of imposition of the mind on nature. In other words, where you're having mind over material, where the earth is this kind of optimism that went with the Enlightenment. And you can sort of see a sort of representation of it, a creation of a kind of world here. And you get the intellectual world, with the centered in Enlightenment salons in Paris, where you have the lady who's the hostess who invites various philosophers and artists and musicians and aristocrats together. And usually they would have 20 or 30 invited to a session, but I think the word got out that they were doing a group photo. And so Rousseau turned up, Montesquieu, Diderot, some of the leading lights of the Enlightenment. And in terms of representation in art, something of the flavor, the confidence, and I guess I want to mention a couple of the qualities with the Enlightenment, is one would be balance and order and calm and grace. There was a new conception, graceful. So not just what one did, but how one did it. So in the Enlightenment, the 18th century is also known as the age of aristocracy. I thought I'd dress for the occasion. And so you see Watteau in his paintings conveying some of these senses and feeling. Again, with this figure here, this a Venetian night gathering, and there's this term. Ignore this print here, but fête galante. So this is gathering. It's a French term, which means sort of a refined, elegant gathering of men and women together in a graceful manner. So here we have pilgrimage to the Isle of Cythera. And something about that is there was a kind of expectation on the part of the viewers that they would know what Cythera signified. Cythera, you remember we saw Venus there standing on the half shell? Well, she was actually being blown to shore. And she was just about to come to shore, and there was that goddess who was about to put that cloak over her. You remember? The shore she was coming to was Cythera. So this is an isle that's known as the Isle of Venus, also known as the Isle of Love. And so what you've got here is these people, these dignified, aristocratic people, cultured people, and they are good. You see, they're about. It looks to me like they're about to depart, and you see her looking backwards with a little bit of wistfulness. This Rococo style. Another of the painters of this Rococo period, along with Watteau, was Francois Boucher. And Boucher's spirit of painting. So there's a kind of elegance, a grace, balance, an ordered quality that are part of these Enlightenment characteristics, part of this movement in France at that time. Boucher's leading patron was a very important figure at court, Madame de Pompadour. The King of France at that time was the successor to Louis XIV, Louis XV. And Madame de Pompadour was his chief. You know how kings will have chief ministers? Madame de Pompadour was his chief mistress. And she had a great deal of influence, and she had a lot to do with this sort of type of art style. Here's another representation of Madame de Pompadour. You got to get there quick. You only have that moment to enjoy Madame de Pompadour. And Tiepolo. Okay, so these were French painters who were conveying some of these qualities of the Enlightenment, giving us a visual representation. There were also Italian painters. The Enlightenment was an international movement. So Tiepolo, well, no, we're doing it. It doesn't even work for that. But you can see just the grace and the dignity and the elegance of these aristocratic people doing the minuet out in nature. I don't know where the musicians are. And an English painter, again, conveying this sort of sense of order, measured quality, dignity, a kind of intellectual quality as well. You know, you can see they would be having a discussion as they walk. Très bien. I pause one more time. Any comments or questions? Yes?
Geographically, where would the Isle of Cythera be?
Geographically, where is the Isle of Cythera? It is in the Aegean. It's one of the small Greek islands in the Aegean. Yeah. The question is, how is it that yes, Botticelli had special protection, being with the Medicis, but not every painter had the Medicis as their patron, and there were a lot of painters who started painting in this mode. I guess what I want to say, and why didn't the church come down on them? I guess what I want to say is the leadership of the church were aristocrats also. In other words, the first son of an aristocrat, let's say a duke, would become a duke. The second son would become a bishop. And often that bishop would become a cardinal. And sometimes that bishop would become a pope. So a term that's used in the time of the Renaissance was the Renaissance papacy. And for a period of almost a century, there were a series of 9 popes, each one of whom was personally a humanist. See, he was at that sophisticated level. It wasn't until the time of the Counter-Reformation, around 1550, that you have a pope come in who is not a humanist. And he's the one who hired the artist to cover up the nudes on the Last Judgment. See what I'm saying? So it was the people who were the leaders of the church were sophisticated in this manner themselves. They came from that aristocratic class. Très bien. Good. So let's proceed. Art resisting history. So Renaissance was a historical cultural development, Enlightenment, and you can see the artists celebrating qualities of the Enlightenment. And with Romanticism, there is a reaction because a historical development around 1800 was the Industrial Revolution. This is sort of a traditional craftsman's forge. You can see the family coming. You know, maybe they're bringing lunch. The children can come. They can be there in the workshop. That's not a problem. That's the traditional way in which things were manufactured. But with the harnessing of steam power, something different happens. Something very different. You get a kind of mechanization that allows for a lot of speed, a lot of production, a real change in the nature of life. So right on the heels of the Enlightenment, just to give the time period for the Enlightenment, is 1700 to 1789. By 1800, in places like England, the Industrial Revolution is already in full swing. And where instead of, and what you get with this is instead of artists supporting this historical development, they oppose it. And so these instances of romantic art I'm going to show you, I would call protest art. Art that is protesting what is going on in society. So Turner, this British painter, Queen Mab's castle. Well, Queen Mab was the queen of the fairies and the elves. Fairies and elves are very different, occupy a very kind of different conceptual world than the Industrial Revolution. And there's a kind of haziness in Turner's paintings that's quite intentional. In other words, this is not out of focus. This is how Turner wanted it. He wanted an air of mystery. The mist that's here.
The previous one showed more air pollution.
Ah, yes. This was air pollution, and this is simple mist. Thank you, Jerry. So I guess what I'm saying is this is a protest against this. And here's a German painter, because the Industrial Revolution was getting going in Germany as well. And there was a kind of, again, this sort of mist, soft, but also this Gothic quality. In other words, in the Enlightenment, what was celebrated was much more the Renaissance. Once you get to Romanticism, what's celebrated is the medieval, is the Gothic. The before you start getting development, there's a kind of nostalgia for this kind of society that had this Gothic quality to it. We go quickly here. Boom. Isn't that lovely, though? So 1815. This is not a painting from medieval times. This is a painting from a time, a much more modern time period, in the 19th century. As a reaction, I'm saying this is a form of protest to a society. Turner does, in 1835, there's a huge conflagration, the huge fire in London in which the Houses of Parliament burn up. It takes 2 days for them to burn. And all of London, sort of gathers on the banks of the river to watch this blaze. And Turner gets out his brushes, and in his manner, he does this burning of the Houses of Parliament. Well, now they're going to need a new House of Parliament. This is this is the seat of power in the British Empire. Now, the year is 1835. Well, what kind of modern, they've developed Portland cement. They've developed new architectural means. What kind of style are they going to give to the new House of Parliament that they're going to build? Medieval. Gothic revival. By 1837, the plan has been approved for the new Houses of Parliament. The old Houses of Parliament, by the way, were not Gothic. They were much more sort of Georgian was the style. But for this Gothic revival, and so at the very seat of power, there's a kind of embedded protest. The leading landscape painter at this time is John Constable. And here, get ready. All right. So here's an irony. This is the time of the Industrial Revolution. The great age of English landscape painting was during the Industrial Revolution, not in the previous period. In other words, Constable is showing us another world. He's showing us an earlier, and in his view, better world. Here's the towpath. No, we don't get it. So in this towpath, we've got we have an image of a different pace of life. By this time, railroads are coming onto the scene. And Constable wants to give us a different impression. He wants to give us a different sort of pace of life, quality of life. So you see how I'm saying that this is a type of protest art? Constable is the leading painter in England at this time. And this is one of the reasons, is this is a feeling that a lot of people have. This is an English painter, Thomas Cole, who actually emigrated to the United States. Not in protest or anything, his family moved. As a teenager, he moved with his family. But when he came, he had some of those attitudes, some of those romantic attitudes. And he did a series of paintings that are called the Course of Empire series. So the savage state. See the teepees here? And see the brave here? Sort of chasing the deer. And keep an eye on this peak, because you'll see it in the later paintings as well. So this savage state. Romantics like the savage state. One of the early sort of proto-romantics was the philosopher Rousseau, who talked about the noble savage. Well, if there's any painting that depicts the noble savage, I would say it's this one, savage state. But it's not a degraded state. It's something that in a way is idealized. And then the second one in the series, the pastoral state. And you can see, and pastoral, so here you have shepherds, you can see this Greek temple, we see that peak again. And you see this kind of nature is parkland. Very much of an Enlightenment scene. This is kind of depiction of an ideal Enlightenment setting. At Boucher would often do paintings set in exactly this kind of beautiful Arcadia was a term that was used. The pastoral state. So civilization has risen up. It's no longer savage. It's now pastoral. So it's kind of, I think in a way they're sort of saying, okay, this is like the Greeks. This is like ideal Greek civilization. And then things go further. Consummation of empire. So is this Rome? Are we seeing sort of like Rome sort of, what do I want to say, sort of concentrated. Sort of concentrate of Rome is here. The full empire. And the illusion is clear to all the viewers. This is the British Empire that Cole is painting here. So British Empire, which the foundation of the British Empire was the Industrial Revolution. In other words, the reasons that England was the great economic power was because of it had been the home of the Industrial Revolution. And you see the empire, the consummation of empire. Now, just look at this. This is a romantic who's painting this. Romantics, Rousseau, differed from the other philosophers of the Enlightenment in that he thought civilization was a corrupting influence. The other Enlightenment philosophers believed that civilization was an elevating influence. It had to do with education, it had to do with refinement, it had to do with cultivation. Rousseau, as a proto-romantic, had problems with civilization. Where does civilization lead? Well, there's a lot of power that's being exerted here. If you think of the Roman Empire, where they're dominating all these peoples in the world, well, you had that happen with the British Empire as well, yes? British Empire. What's the expression about the British Empire? How wide it spread? The sun never sets. That means a whole lot of the world, this little island, was dominating a whole lot of the world. Consummation of empire. So, as a romantic, Cole was not a fan of this. What he liked much better in some ways was this. Destruction of empire. You know, what's the expression? What goeth before a fall? This is the fall. As the barbarians came to Rome, here they're going to come. In a way, really, this is a romantic message. You're going to build up. Go ahead, build up your civilization. But it's going to fall, because it's going to be artificial, because it's going against things the natural way. In other words, Constable was showing us the natural way, yes? He was showing us in those landscapes, with the towpath. He was showing us a much more natural way of life. And Cole, who is thoroughly in agreement and an admirer of Constable, this is what he would say would be inevitable. This is what's going to happen with this sort of empire. It's going to be destroyed. And then, so this is the fourth in a 5-part series, 5-painting series. These are all huge canvases. And then you get the one the Romantics really like. Ruins. Desolation. You see how I'm saying this is a type of protest art? Because what's going on in the world at this time is expansion of empire. Expansion of industrial empire, financial empire, civilized empire. I pause. Any questions on this?
Able to appreciate.
Yes, where were these paintings displayed? You know, it kind of depends on the country. A lot of, like Cole's, for instance, were in public exhibition in major cities. And the French had the paintings we saw, they had an annual salon that everybody in Paris and a lot of people in France would go and see these major paintings. So they actually had a fair amount of distribution to them. In other words, it wasn't just that they were tucked away in some wealthy person's home, especially in the later periods. Not so much in the early Renaissance, those pieces like Venus Rising was something only aristocratic guests to the Medici villa would see. But with some of the other arts, David was out there in front of City Hall on the public square. Okay? Yes, sir.
The dates that you've chosen for the paintings of protest serve as an excellent reminder that various art forms often move in concert.
Mm-hmm.
And Beethoven comes along in music with what you might call music of protest,
Mm-hmm.
and dies in 1827, which ushers in the Romantic period of music.
Yes.
And at the same time, Victor Hugo in literature starts coming out with his works in the 1830s. So you have 3 art forms moving at the same time.
Yes, and I would include in this as a romantic, part of the Romantic movement would be Charles Dickens. In other words, as somebody who thinking of Oliver Twist or a story like that, as a protest against the slums of London, this kind of mega city that's developing. So yes, absolutely, yes. I love that you say, and speaking of Beethoven, that it's in concert, because indeed it was. Yes, please.
Do you think there's any connection between the art of protest and the British struggle to abolish slavery?
Pardon me. The question is about this whether there's a correlation with this Romantic movement, and I would say in many ways, because the Romantics really did have a emphasis on human nature and a question about civilized versus savage. And part of the justification that was given by pro-slavery people at this time was that we are bringing civilizing influence to the benighted savages in the world. And the people who were the leaders of the abolitionist movement did not have that kind of view, that there were these civilized, good people and these savages, degenerated sort of people. And so I would say absolutely there was an element of romanticism in the abolitionist movement. Yes. Okay. Shall we proceed? Because we got one more to go. We have where artists are themselves creating history. Not just responding to history, historical developments, but actually influencing them. Art of revolution. So it's particularly in revolutionary periods. And if there's one single individual who had more influence than any other artist in terms of making history, it's David. So 1784. 1784, it's 5 years before the beginning of the French Revolution. And at the annual Salon, there are thousands of paintings each year that are put on display, but there are always 5 or 10 that are the really prominent ones that all the critics write about in the papers, that people line up to see. Well, in 1784, the sensation of the Salon was Oath of the Horatii. And this is where we were seeing that Rococo painting, elevated and refined and graceful, right? When we were seeing Watteau, we were seeing Boucher. This was a reaction to that kind of art. And it was a response to the crisis that France was in by that time. By 1784, the French state was in very, very serious states, on the brink of bankruptcy. And things had to change. And one of the things that in David's view had to change was the way in which people saw themselves as members of society. People needed to take responsibility. People needed to step up. And so I guess what I want to say here with the Oath of the Horatii, the educated class of people, I know who the Horatii is. We don't know who the Horatii is because we don't have the kind of training that education had. Education in the 18th century, in the time of the Enlightenment, the training that people got was in the classics. They studied Greek and Roman philosophy, Greek and Roman literature, Greek and Roman history. They didn't study French history in France. They studied, at university, they studied Greek and Roman history. So in Roman history, Rome in 500 BC had been a kingdom, an Etruscan kingdom. The Romans had an Etruscan king over them. Around 500 BC, they had a revolt and they set up a republic, the Roman Republic, and it lasted for 500 years. And it was, and in the early days, when they were just getting the republic going, there was a civil war by the royalists to try to make a monarchy again. And the Horatii were a family. The father was one of the leaders of the republic, and his sons took an oath that they would fight to the death to save the republic, to preserve the republic. And so here they are. They're taking their oath. That was a Roman oath. They would take that stance. And this had a message to it. In other words, David and some other artists were doing paintings like this, really wanted to make the point, it's time to get serious here. We can't luxuriate in the Enlightenment anymore. We need to get serious about saving the state. So this is a patriotic work. The Horatii were a patriotic Roman family, and this was what this evocation was. 5 years later, the king finally has to call the Estates General because the crisis has absolutely come to a head. France is bankrupt. Something serious has to happen. So the king calls the legislature for the first time in 150 years. He calls the Estates General and then is upset because the members of the Third Estate, the sort of commoners, aren't playing ball with the nobles and the church, who are the other two estates. And so he locks them out of the assembly hall. So their response to that is they're at Versailles, because that's where the government met. Not in Paris, but at Versailles, outside of Paris. And so the only other building at Versailles that was large enough to hold the 400 representatives of the Third Estate was a tennis court. And their tennis court was indoors, like a squash court. That's kind of how tennis was then. So when they were there, they took an oath that they would not disband until there was a written constitution. And furthermore, they declared themselves the National Assembly. They declared themselves the ruling body of the state. So, and this is a painting done by David. However, there was a print, an etching made of this, of which thousands and thousands, but maybe 50,000 copies were made of this and sold like hotcakes through Paris. Everybody in Paris had one of David's prints of the tennis court oath. So you were asking about how many people saw this. Well, not many people saw the painting necessarily, but they all saw the prints. And in the prints, they all noticed these individuals over here. See any resemblance? Those individuals here with them? Everyone seeing that print remembered from 5 years ago the sensation of the Salon, Oath of the Horatii. That's what David is making really clear, just in case anybody has any questions what we're talking about here. We're talking about just what I was talking about with Oath of the Horatii. These are the heroes of the new republic. In fact, see this figure here? See in this composition? What's he doing there? You know, we've got the speaker in the middle. What's he about? Well, he is serving as Horatii, the father. Does that make sense? So this is an expression, artistic expression. This is a quotation. David is putting a quotation in his later work that everyone will recognize and will have a greater resonance thereby. Abduction of the Sabine women. This is a story, again, for Roman history. And what it has to do with is, sometimes works like this are entitled The Rape of the Sabine Women. But abduction is more like it, because what was happening, Rome was this community that was of a certain size, and next to it, the neighbors, the people in the next community over were the Sabines. They were a little larger community. They were both under the Etruscans. And the Romans had a situation where they had some of their women die, and they had a shortage of women. And they wanted to get invited to Sabine dances. And the Sabines wouldn't invite them. They wouldn't let them come. The Sabine men wouldn't let the Roman men come to there. So they came and did a raid. And they grabbed some of these Sabine women and married them. And then Rome fully, sort of expanded over time. But that's how Rome kind of grew out of being just a small little community. The first thing was the Sabine women. So this is something that in art there'd be scores of representations over the centuries. And this was done in kind of the late Renaissance. All right. David does a painting, 1799. So this is now 10 years after the tennis court oath. The French Revolution has happened. The division, the reign of terror. The entire aristocratic class of France was either executed or had gone into exile as émigrés. And when some of them would slip back, they'd be put on trial for crimes against society by the revolutionary government. And so those émigrés, they were in places like Germany and France and Holland. Where did they long to be? Back in France. But they couldn't do that. Well, Napoleon, by 1799, Napoleon has taken power. And Napoleon wants to sort of put an end to some of the excesses of the revolution. And so one of the things he does is, in 1799, an amnesty, a general amnesty. He kind of takes the most notorious of the royalists, makes a list, about 1,000. You guys can't come back. The other 300,000, 400,000 can come back. General amnesty. But there was a lot of ill feeling towards these émigrés. And what David is doing here in this painting is he's making a statement. This is from a scene 2 or 3 years after the abduction. The Sabines kind of got their army and their forces together and did a counterattack on the Romans to get their women back. Well, it's 2 or 3 years later. The women have all been married to these Roman guys, and they're starting families. And they don't want to be sort of torn from their new family. They don't want to be torn from their children. So what happened in this story is that the Sabine women who were there in Rome took their kids and came and right in between the two armies. They're all getting ready to fight. The Sabines are getting ready to fight on this side. Romans are getting ready to fight on this side. This lady was the daughter of the Sabine chieftain, and her husband was Romulus, the head of the sort of Roman party. And she is going, and this is her father here. And she's going, no, don't do this. This is the intervention of the Sabine women. We need reconciliation here. We don't need warfare. And this is what David is using art to make this point. Does this make sense? It's a very powerful point. See these fragile infants and these nursing mothers? See this lady holding up her baby? You really want to kill your grandson? We're now part of these people. And so what winds up happening historically is they join together. The Romans and the Sabines join together. Because of the action of the Sabine women, instead of there being war, there was reconciliation. All right. So David, notice this in the background. I said that David had the most sort of popular print at the beginning of the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, the most popular print was by another painter, another artist. Oh, excuse me. Here's another story before I get to that. Guérin was a student of David, and this is a story that, again, people would know who knew Roman history. Marcus Sextus was a Roman who, in a difficult time, a sort of time of conflict, had to go into exile. And he had been a leader, and he got called back. He was given leave by the government to return to Rome because his wife was dying. And he got there a day late. And so this is the scene where he's arrived on the scene, his wife has died, and it's a tragedy. In other words, it was because of intolerance of him as an exile, as an emigre, that he had this fate. So again, Guérin is making a point here. It's time for reconciliation. It's time to let these people come back. It's time to heal the community. So, okay, this is this print I was mentioning. Storming the Bastille. So this is a painting, but this was also done as a print. And thousands of this print circulated through Paris and through France. When David does his painting of the Sabine women, notice this tower of the Bastille. He puts that quotation in there, making it clear, in case anybody thinks I'm talking about ancient Rome. You see? We're talking about here and now. I pause. It's time for a little sip of wine. Any questions on this? Art influencing history? These are paintings. David's the leading painter in France at this time. And he's making a point on influence affecting history. But no.
Sorry for asking so many questions. Sorry if I'm saying so many things and asking so many questions. But it's kind of interesting when, like we're saying, history always repeats itself. You're looking at the artwork, and it's like you can really see how people are starting to make big connections and how the artists were, honestly, if you think about it, very educated people in
Yes.
society being able to make these
Yes.
connections from Roman to...
Right. Yes, because David has had this kind of enlightenment training that his audience has. And so he's able to, he's knowledgeable enough, as Botticelli had been knowledgeable about Greek and Roman mythology, he was knowledgeable enough to produce art that would be recognized by the educated classes, and often other people besides. Shall we proceed? Yes. All right, because we got one more little section. This may be a little bit more familiar. Paul Revere was a silversmith in Boston. He was also an artist, and he was a patriot. And when the Boston Massacre happened, it was a little-known event. Didn't actually have a lot of play to it, but Revere made this print. Again, this was a print that, again, circulated by the thousands all through the colonies to let people know what had happened, that the British troops were stationed in Boston as if it was enemy territory. The colonists thought of themselves as British citizens. The British Army was not supposed to be in England. They didn't allow the British Army to be stationed in British cities. And here in Boston, there was a British Army stationed. And an outrage happened where troops fired on citizens. And so Revere does this. And then Revere does his midnight ride. Actually, there were two riders. There was a Dr. Dawes, William Dawes, who actually was the one who really alerted the countryside. Paul Revere got arrested and he basically was in the cooler for the night, or most of the night. But it was Paul Revere who comes up with this midnight ride, and so it becomes part of American legend. This is, of course, a much later version of it. But I guess the point I was sort of making is that he's using art to promote the revolution. And Tumbrel, Battle of Bunker Hill. Well, this is not what the battle looked like. You know, here's the British troops here, here's the American commander. They're sort of standing there at odds. Here's this sort of romantic, pirate-looking type person. And it was being done. Trumbull is kind of doing a glorification of the American cause because the British Army was, at this point, the most powerful army in the world, and these colonists, these Americans, were standing up to them. And at Bunker Hill, they gave them more than they got. And Washington crossing into Delaware. So this is a later work, but I guess what I want to say is here is an artist who is promoting a sense of American nationhood, American patriotism. I mean, it was pretty cold. It was also dark. Do you really think Washington was standing up all the way? But that's not the point. The point is the art was being used to influence society, to influence people. Is that making sense, this sort of point about this distinction on use of art? Trumbull, British surrender at Yorktown. The story here, by the way, is Cornwallis was the British general, and he was in his tent because he had a nosebleed. And so he sent his second in command, one of his aides, to take the surrender. And Washington, who was all prepared to meet Cornwallis and be courteous to him and gracious, goes, well, fine. He sends his aide to camp out. So part of this picture is Washington standing back there going, you're not going to one-up me, Cornwallis. And then we get the Spirit of 76. Archibald Willard, who does this in 1870. Notice the date. The centennial's coming up. He wants something to help sort of promote this, remind people of what was, the heroism of these patriots that made this, forged this country. The Yankee Doodle, where the British, Yankee Doodle, that song, Yankee Doodle went to town riding, was a British insult. Stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Macaroni was a term for a fancy Italian dandy. And so he's sort of saying, these colonists are such hayseeds in the song. These colonists are such hayseeds, they're such Yankee Doodles that they think by taking their farmer's cap and putting a feather in it, they are now like an Italian dandy, right? Well, of course, the colonists, they all took pride in this. And so they sang Yankee Doodle all the time. And so here Archibald Willard is doing this. And here's another artist who celebrates a revolution, Delacroix, 1830, in France, sort of glorifying revolution. A point I want to make on this. This was on public display. This was the sensation of the Salon of 1830. That's when there was a revolution in 1830. Les Miserables. Somebody talked about Victor Hugo. That was the revolution of 1830 that is in Les Miserables. And Delacroix, within weeks of this event, painted it and it put it in the Salon. And it was the sensation of the Salon. The French government purchased this for like $5 million, put it on display for about 3 months. People lined up for blocks to see it. And then at the end of the show, they carefully rolled it up and put it away for 40 years. Governments don't like paintings that celebrate revolution. It wasn't until the next revolution in 1870 that they brought it out again. So at any rate, and Delacroix, by the way, painted himself into this. See this painting here? This figure here, Delacroix painted himself into this. So here we get these two paintings celebrating revolution. Oh, a point I want to make is they took this one, Willard, this was his first draft. He thought, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. And so this is the one we're familiar with today. So Yankee Doodle. Questions?
Any questions?
Comments?
I'll make a comment.
Jerry's going to make a comment.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. A very enlightening presentation indeed.
Especially the Enlightenment part, right?
Yes. And I thought I'd bring up, since I might as well boast about my wife, who got her master's thesis on the history of California through art. And to remind myself into it, I was the photographer for her, and we actually went to every California mission. Not everybody has been to every California mission. We have, and we took pictures of it. I just thought I'd bring that up.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we have a couple over here. Yes.
Again, the same year as Delacroix' Liberty Leading the People, 1830. Elliott comes out with Symphony Pastiche, which is often thought of as the first romantic piece of music.
Terrific. Thank you. Yep. Again, this sort of, it's not just happening in painting, it's happening in other art forms as well, these waves.
Is that figure,
Go ahead, you started.
is that figure on the right an Indian?
This figure on the right, here, no, I wouldn't say so. He looks a little like an Indian, but I wouldn't say so. No, he's one of the colonists. Yes.
You mentioned in France many of these paintings were circulated, but you didn't mention the invention of the printing press. Did that apply?
Yes, well, I'll tell you, that had happened beforehand, and quite a bit beforehand, more like in the time of the Renaissance, but something I want to sort of say in relationship to that, and this is particularly with, in the 18th century where we had those prints of David and prints of the French Revolution. One of the things that made that possible in terms of technology, so here we have the Industrial Revolution, was by that time they had developed very cheap paper. And so they were able to mass produce prints and etchings like that so that they'd have 50,000, 100,000 sold and distributed. Previous to that, they really couldn't do that. So that's just kind of a point on this, that relative to the printing press had been around for a while, but it took a while before they had paper that was cheap enough for mass production. Okay? All right.
Bruce, you want to thank you for, we have one more question?
Yes.
What about the color in paint and the reproductions? That's what interests me.
Oh, the color and the reproductions. Well, let me just say on this, how we saw some prints that were colored? Something that you could buy the $10 one for black and white and the $50 one that would be colored. You know what I'm saying? They would have like workshops that would do color. They couldn't print in color at that point, but they'd be hand colored, and so you could get the $50 ones. Yep. All right. I want to say to you guys, as usual, Oakmont, a dynamite audience. Thank you very much.